Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 598, Koume's World, Part 5. Kawai Koume's diary tells us nothing about her experiences in the first few months of 1868, or as she would know it, the first year of the Meiji era. Now there's a few plausible explanations for why that might be the case. Perhaps, given the unsettled nature of the times, news every day of outbreaks of violence, assassination, the collapse of the government itself, she just didn't have the time or energy to write. Maybe she was too busy trying to ensure the Kawai household itself had what was necessary to survive. Perhaps, given the economic situation and how unstable prices were, she couldn't get her hands on paper and ink. I said in the very first episode of this series that there is no reason to think that either Koume herself or her great-grandson, the one who actually edited her diaries for publication a century later, removed anything after the fact. And that's true. There's no evidence of it, and I would not encourage anyone to rush to that conclusion. But still, given the events of early 1868, here I can't help but wonder a little bit. In Kyushu, as basically everywhere else, the new year brought a great deal of uncertainty. Just a few months earlier, the last Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, had announced his abdication in Kyoto and returned his powers to the long irrelevant imperial court, now led by the boy emperor Meiji. However, that was not the end of things. A faction of radicals at court wanted to punish Yoshinobu for the perceived sins of the Tokugawa family, and for his part, Yoshinobu may have been hoping to play along with things for a time with the new order, and then reestablish his power. Why things eventually did come to blows is perhaps not that important for us right now. What matters is that they did. Yoshinobu ended up fleeing down to Osaka after his abdication, and eventually did marshal an army with the intent to return to Kyoto and reassert his power. He was met by an army of anti-shogunate loyalists loyal to the imperial court, and in late January 1868, the pro-Tokugawa army was defeated at the Battle of Toba Fushimi, just south of Kyoto. Yoshinobu would retreat to Osaka and then flee east, and though some of his supporters would keep the fight up until 1869, for all intents and purposes after this point, the old Tokugawa-led order was dead. And this presented a few pretty big problems for Kyushu as a feudal domain. First and most obviously, Kyushu was aligned to the Tokugawa shogunate and its family. Its daimyo, its feudal lord, was Tokugawa Mochitsugu, a relative of the shogun from one of the branch families of the Tokugawa clan. And within weeks of the victory at Toba Fushimi, Mochitsugu came under suspicion among the extremists at the emperor's court. They accused the Lord of Kyushu of having helped Yoshinobu escape after the defeat at Toba Fushimi. Tokugawa Mochitsugu almost certainly did not do this. Mochitsugu was in fact very clever in reading the room, so to speak, and appears to have made the call to abandon the shogunate even before the final victory at Toba Fushimi. Mochitsugu, as a loyal relative of the shogun, had been ordered to mobilize his forces to help support the attack on Kyoto, but he had dithered and slow-walked that mobilization to avoid committing his forces to the battle, presumably hoping to protect his own position in the event that the shogun was defeated. And of course, it turned out that this had been a very clever choice. In the aftermath of the Battle of Toba Fushimi, envoys from the newly proclaimed imperial government came to Mochitsugu's capital city of Wakayama, and Mochitsugu was ready to receive them and told them he would be happy to collaborate with the new regime. To which said envoys replied they were very grateful for his cooperation, particularly given his challenging situation as a relative of the shogun, but of course, his role as a member of the wider Tokugawa family also meant he owed some restitution to the imperial court for the centuries of mistreatment and neglect that the imperial family had suffered at the hands of the shogunate. Perhaps a gift of 150,000 gold ryo would suffice to show his gratitude at the new government's willingness to forgive him. That was a pretty substantial fraction, a bit over 1/4 of the domain's on-paper annual income, and Mochitsugu was able to negotiate his gift to the new regime down to a more manageable 30,000 gold ryo in exchange for his promise to commit his own soldiers to the ongoing campaigns to pacify the holdouts of the Tokugawa shogunate. And so it was that about 1,500 samurai from Kishu domain, who had been trained to fight in defense of the shogunate, ended up taking part in the war between the pro-shogunate domains in the imperial court on the side of the imperial court. So far as I know, Tokugawa Mochitsugu is the only member of the Tokugawa family who managed to jump ship in this way, so to speak. But again, it really worked out for him, as did his other big swing for the fences during this time. Because after securing his position, Mochitsugu spent much of the first year of the new era implementing a massive administrative reform to his domain, perhaps because he felt Kishu domain would need to be strengthened for whatever came next, perhaps because he felt that proving himself to be an able reformist who was not too wedded to the past was the best way to cover his own rear. Whatever his reasoning, the changes were sweeping. First came salary reductions across the board for the domain retainers to save some money, alongside 2 pills to help the bitter medicine go down. The publication for the first time ever of the domain's financial ledgers so that people could see the tenuous financial footing that Kishu domain was actually on, and an announcement that Tokugawa Mochitsugu himself would donate 5% of his own income to the domain budget. Then came a new wave of announcements that the domain military was going to modernize. A modern army and navy would be created with the help of trainers hired by the Kingdom of Prussia, what would shortly become the German Empire, with a new law subjecting all men of the domain, regardless of whether or not they were samurai, to military conscription. These conscripts would supplement a standing military force composed only of samurai, but still, this was a pretty radical idea, an extension of the conscription system that was already in place in Kishu. It was even more radical because this time Mochitsugu announced that leadership roles in the military would be open to anyone regardless of their background, based purely on merit. Both low-ranking samurai and even talented commoners could work their way up the ranks, and within the domain administration he implemented similar reforms to open up jobs based on merit rather than family status. By 1871, new edicts did come down from the nation's capital at Tokyo, the former city of Edo, announcing the feudal system was to be abolished and the conscription system would be extended nationally. But by this time, Tokugawa Mochitsugu had proven himself to be both an able leader and a firm ally of the new government. By the time feudalism was abolished, Kishu had a 17,500-man army and far more stable finances than basically any other feudal domain in the country, and if that didn't prove that Tokugawa Mochitsugu was a friend of the new government, he'd also managed to befriend one of his own former samurai who was now an influential figure at the imperial court. Mutsu Munemitsu was one of the new high-ranking players in Tokyo, and I would call him somewhat uncharitably a B-list figure of the Meiji Restoration. He was from Kishu domain originally, and he'd been active in the anti-Tokugawa movement from the 1860s, palling around with guys like Sakamoto Ryoma and Ito Hirobumi. He would eventually become Japan's foreign minister and a fairly influential figure in the new government, if not one of the major players. Mochitsugu, within months of jumping ship to the shogunate, had invited Mutsu to Wakayama with open arms and even asked for his advice in promoting his new reforms. And because Mochitsugu's reforms provided a roadmap for administrative and military modernization in other parts of Japan, and because Mutsu Munemitsu was willing to vouch for him, yeah, this guy's totally above board even though he's a member of the Tokugawa family, the former daimyo of Kishu would end up a decorated member of Japan's new British-style aristocracy, a marquis specifically, and live out a comfortable retirement as a well-established supporter of the new regime until his death in 1906. So, for the Lord of Wakayama Castle, things worked out pretty well. But what did Kawai Koume think of all of this? Well, we have no idea. Her diary doesn't pick back up until the start of 1876, or as Koume calls it, the 9th year of the Meiji era, by which time Wakayama looked very different from what it had been a decade earlier. For one thing, Koume was now a widow. Hyozo had died in 1871, during the period not covered by the diary. We don't know much about his passing. I think we can assume that even 5 years later, the memory would be a painful one for Koume. For another thing, the family finances, which had turned around pretty well in the 1860s, were once again back in the dumps. The Kawai were one of the families hit by the salary reductions brought by Tokugawa Mochitsugu's reforms, and by 1876, their privileges as members of the samurai class had largely been legislated away. Similarly, the Domain Academy, which had been the employer of both Koume's husband, Hyozo, and her son, Yusuke, now no longer existed because, of course, Kishu Domain no longer existed. The funds from the Kawai family's private academy, which had been founded by Koume's grandfather, had largely dried up too. As the government in far-off Tokyo had begun to modernize frantically, there wasn't exactly a huge calling for the type of traditional Confucian education the Kawai family had specialized in. Still, it wasn't all doom and gloom. One of the first things Koume records in 1876 is that her son was on the verge of scoring a job. Because while the new government had torn down a lot of the old systems of feudal education, it didn't exactly take a genius to realize that something would have to replace them, and so starting in 1871, a newly founded Ministry of Education began the program of setting up genuinely national schools, modeled first on the American educational system and then shifting towards a more German-oriented model. Now, the ins and outs of all the various educational models and reforms tried out in the early Meiji era are a little bit beyond our scope. The upshot is that over the course of the 1870s, even as old schools were shuttering at a very rapid rate, new ones were being founded to prepare the youth of Japan for the new age. Well, really, a lot of the new schools were just old schools that had been converted, but you get the idea. As the diary picks up, Kawai Yusuke, now with the death of Hyozo, the head of household for the Kawai family, was in the middle of applying for his government-issued teacher's license, which he received and was able to pick up from the prefectural records office in Wakayama by January 31st, because by this point Japan had switched to the Gregorian calendar. Now all he needed was a job, and fortunately there was a new school looking for a new teacher. Indeed, there were several. Wakayama's prefectural government, which had replaced the old Kishu domain government, had announced a policy that there would be one elementary school for every 1,500 residents of the prefecture. Now, at this point, elementary education was the only compulsory level of education, so all these schools would be elementary schools. By 1875, Wakayama had 362 such schools, with an enrollment of 21,000 students, so an average of about 60 a school. Which was pretty impressive given the system had come together in just a few years, but it represented just a fraction of eligible school-age children, 22% of kids between 6 and 14, which were the ages of elementary education at the time, 9% of girls, 34% of boys. Yusuke was looking at a job for one of these new schools in the village of Nishimura, about 13 kilometers, about 8 miles or so, from Wakayama. The pay was not great, 4 yen a month, but it basically doubled the family's average income, and at a time when Japan was still on the gold standard, the yen was worth a lot more than it is today. Still, it'd be a hard transition. Yusuke would have to move to Nishimura to do this job, and rent a place in town. 13 kilometers both ways every day was just not going to work if you had to walk. And while Yusuke would be the head teacher for this school, he wouldn't really be calling the shots. You see, even though the government mandated all these schools, it didn't cover the costs, nor did the tuition required of students. 6.5 sen, or about 6% of 1 yen for the first 2 children. The third child and beyond attended free, and there were discounts if you had proven economic hardship. Most of the operating budget for Wakayama's schools came from special taxes levied on the wealthiest families in each village, and these families paid those taxes, but they expected, in return, a degree of influence over the school. In the case of Nishimura Elementary, this meant that the Ida, Kamata, and Yukawa families, the leading wealthy peasant and headman families of the area, would demand a little bit of extra power over what exactly was being taught. Mr. Ida himself even paid Yusuke a little extra stipend of rice for his trouble as a teacher, in return for making sure his own children got a little bit of extra attention from the instructor. Still, what these families wanted and what Yusuke wanted to teach probably wouldn't have been that different. When the Ministry of Education made elementary schooling compulsory in 1871, it did not, in point of fact, specify what exactly should be taught in these elementary schools. There was a general directive that long-neglected subjects like science, mathematics, and foreign languages that were not Chinese, especially English, should have some priority, but there were no consistent rules about enforcing any kind of standard curriculum. And regardless of those directives from the Ministry of Education, the wealthy families that had hired Yusuke would generally want something more traditional. They were still largely farmers, after all, and not that caught up in all this mania for science and technology that was so big in the cities. Traditional Confucian-style education was, in the countryside, still really seen as a marker of status. So it made sense they'd want to hire a guy like Kawai Yusuke, who they would see, since he used to teach the samurai children of Wakayama, as a pretty big get. Eventually, the government would catch on to all this, and in 1881, the Ministry of Education would start to enforce a degree of standardization. In 1882, Yusuke would be told to either adapt to the times or shut down his school. He would in the end choose to close the school rather than change his curriculum, though he would continue to offer private tutoring for families that saw a Chinese-style education as a valuable supplement to what was offered in public schools. But we're still many years from that moment in 1876, and of course, where's Koume? Well, devoted mother that she was, she went to Nishimura with her son in February 1876 and spent 2 months helping him set up household there. Generally, the two of them would stay in Nishimura for the week, and then head back to Wakayama on the weekend to see Yusuke's wife Kano and Koume's grandchildren. Koume kept this up all the way until April, when news came that one of those grandchildren, Tsune, had what turned out to be a fortunately very mild case of smallpox. Koume went home to help out, and would not return to Nishimura. So far as I know, other than weekend trips away, this was her only time living outside the family compound in Wakayama that had been the Kawai family home for more than a century at this point. The household she returned to, though, was in a bit more disrepair than it had been for a very long time. Partially, of course, that was down to the fact that there were just fewer people around to help take care of things. Yozo, of course, had passed on, so had Koume's mother Tatsuko. But in real economic terms, the family home had begun to fall into some disrepair. The Kawai, like most samurai families in the 1870s, fell onto some hard times. The transition, as with so many transitions in the early Meiji period, was pretty abrupt. Prefectural records from 1870 show that the Kawai and other samurai families were still getting some of the annual rice stipend they had gotten under the shogunate, though the reforms of 1868 meant the value of that stipend had gone down quite a bit. But sometime in the early 1870s, the record keeping's a bit uneven, so it's hard to know exactly when, that was converted into a cash stipend. For the Kawai, that totaled 48 yen a year, 4 yen a month, so basically even with Yusuke's pay as a teacher. In September 1878, the government finally ended all stipend payments for samurai. They were just too big a drain on financial resources that were needed elsewhere. Samurai families got one final set of government bonds they could redeem over a couple of years, a severance payment in a sense, and that was it. And to make matters worse, poor government financial policies caused rampant inflation during this time, and spiraling upward prices until the financial retrenchments of the early 1880s. So those bonds were not worth all that much in terms of purchasing power, less, in fact, than their face value. The Kawai family had, at least, invested their money wisely in the early Meiji period when they were still getting a stipend. When the government had conducted land surveys to determine ownership of plots according to a new legal code based on the French Napoleonic codes, the Kawai snapped up some of the Nagaya, long tenement houses in the center of Wakayama, that had disputed ownership. Altogether, they had about 60 renters in fairly crowded, cheap conditions, which pulled in an extra 2.5 yen a month. They were, somewhat hilariously, able to double that income from their rental properties by also selling the night soil from them to farmers who wanted to use the leavings, so to speak, as fertilizers. Which honestly is more business sense than I would expect from your average Confucian scholar, so way to go, honestly. Yusuke also invested in a small plot of farmland outside the city he could rent to peasant tenants. I've not found clear numbers on exactly how much land he owned, but it doesn't seem to have been that much. All told, the family income in 1876 was about 150 yen a year. By comparison, at their peak, the Kawai family had been raking in 8,796 momme of silver a year under the old system. Direct value comparisons from the pre- and post-yen era are pretty hard to do, but one of the more straightforward ways is to look at purchasing power. In 1865, 8,796 momme of silver would get you 4,000 grams, 22 koku, of rice. In 1876, 150 yen would get you 19 koku / 3,450 grams, so all told about a 14% income drop at a time when prices were also generally trending up. That's definitely not great, particularly because Yusuke had a pretty large family, 6 children, his wife and his mom to feed, and of course he would lose some of that income when he lost his teaching license. To be honest, though, it's nowhere near the worst case I've seen. A lot of samurai families fell on ruinous hardship in the 1870s, ironically including a lot of the lower-ranking samurai families who had been the spearhead of the movement to overthrow the shogunate in the first place. Their skills, after all, were just not useful. Confucian bureaucrats, warriors, and cultivated gentlemen who had mastered the ways of the brush and sword were out. Western science and administration, conscription, and modern military tactics, those were what were in. Not a lot of samurai, it turned out, had the skills necessary to make that jump. In fact, Koume's diary picks back up at a time when discontent was beginning to boil over from some of those former samurai. A series of anti-government rebellions by former samurai broke out throughout the 1870s, particularly, and again kind of ironically, in the west and south of Japan where anti-shogunate feeling had been the strongest the decade earlier. The largest of those rebellions was the Satsuma Rebellion, led itself by a former figure of the new government, Saigo Takamori, which took 9 months to put down at the cost of tens of thousands of deaths. Koume records her own reaction to the rebellion in her diary, perhaps feeling a bit of sympathy for the rebels as a fellow samurai. On March 9th, she described what she was hearing about one of the first big battles of the conflict, the siege of Kumamoto Castle, but also noted she wasn't quite sure of whether she could believe what she was hearing. Quote, "The newspapers are on sale daily at the corner of each chome, but when things are not going well for our side, publication is suspended, and sometimes the content changes during the day." She repeated this very justified concern that the government was censoring newspapers to avoid bad press a few weeks later, writing that, quote, "Newspapers are not to be relied on." Just generally, Koume seems to have been pretty suspicious of government efforts to prosecute the war, and frankly, reading her account, it's not hard to see why. She describes government medical ships bringing back wounded men from Wakayama Prefecture who were so bedridden by their injuries they could barely crawl, with the prefectural government not having enough medical staff to be able to treat them. The dead, meanwhile, were too expensive to ship home given the strain of getting fresh soldiers and supplies to the front, so in many cases, bereaved families got a bit less than they might have hoped for. Here's an entry from April 6, 1877. "A head came back yesterday of a fellow from Kajibashi. More are expected. In addition, ears are pickled in salt, coming back with names tagged on them. Many names are incorrect." Koume also describes in pretty frank terms a government recruiting drive to convince more men to enlist voluntarily. On April 4, 1877, the former daimyo, Tokugawa Mochitsugu, came back to Wakayama to lead a rally hoping to boost voluntary enlistments. Since Wakayama had once been home to a fairly large domain military that included a conscript element, the place was seen as good recruiting grounds, and rumors went around that Mochitsugu would be offering some sort of handout, a gift, to those who came to hear his speech. That naturally meant there were a lot of people who were willing to go hear that speech, which was just a general celebration of the unification of the nation under the beneficent rule of our young emperor, but the handout that came at the end was not quite what people were hoping for. It wasn't money, it wasn't a gift, it was just 2 pieces of paper. One announcing that Mochitsugu would make charitable donations to support the poor of Wakayama during these hard times, another with a statement from the scholar Fukuzawa Yukichi calling on the people not to cause trouble during this unsettled period. As Koume reported, quote, "Some people mistakenly thought his lordship would give them money, and now they are complaining. They say they took time off work to attend and so they lost 10 sen. All they got was this paper which they may as well use to wipe their asses." Which is a pretty direct critique from a former loyal retainer of this lord, but I can't say again that I blame her for being critical, and certainly this drive did not produce the hoped-for recruitment numbers. On April 14th, the government announced mandatory conscription to fill out the rolls. 8,000 men from Wakayama were conscripted, and while the government initially offered a 30 yen enlistment bonus, very quickly they stopped paying the new recruits anything at all. Still, the disruptions of war were relatively limited in Wakayama itself. Koume only mentions one other, a bit gross but not exactly calamitous. Here's her entry from May 23, 1877. A detachment of soldiers has been billeted in Wakayama. They did all sorts of damage with their swords. Shinpei of the Nagaya was working for a used clothing shop. He was sent to retrieve the futons the army had rented. They were very badly damaged. Some had excrement on them. Others, when they unwrapped them, had pieces missing. It was a huge loss. They are asking the officials to buy them new ones. There were 600 or 700 futons. Rice bowls, bottles, and lamps were strewn all over the place. Since the soldiers were so rough, the authorities had them accompanied to Osaka. There's no mention of whether or not the government ever did pay back the cost of all those damages caused by the conscripts. I would guess probably not. But after this point, the only mentions of the rebellion involve Koume following the news of what was happening on the front. Most of the diary is focused on the far more immediate concerns of daily life. Some of these involved the pleasures of retirement, having more time to paint and visit the theater in particular. In the 1860s portion of the diary, Koume only mentions going to see a stage show once. In the surviving years of the diary from 1876 to 1883, she went over 60 times, often accompanied by her daughter-in-law or her daughter-in-law's mother. Most of the shows were kabuki performances, which is interesting. We often talk about kabuki falling on hard times during the 1870s and 1880s, as the fad for all things Western hit traditional Japanese performing arts particularly hard. However, Koume's record of visiting the theater points to one of the survival strategies used by these embattled theater troupes. Maybe in the big cities there was no appetite for traditional theater with all this newfangled Western stuff, but in smaller cities like Wakayama, there were still audiences looking for an excuse to do what theater-going audiences have always enjoyed doing, dressing up and enjoying the night on the town. Sure, you probably wouldn't make as much as you had been making in Osaka or Edo a decade earlier, but you wouldn't be making nothing either. But given the Kawai family's straitened financial situation, even the cheap kabuki tickets, 5 sen with an additional 6 sen charge for a front row seat, would have started to add up. So how did Koume afford her tickets? Well, she got a job. Really, she'd always had one. She'd been managing the household for decades, and even though her husband was now gone, and Yusuke's wife Kano was the ostensible lady of the house, Koume still pitched in plenty. She seems in particular to have been the one doing a lot of the managing of the family rental properties, and she did arrange with Yusuke to keep some of the revenue for herself as payback for doing that. But her most lucrative work was in the family business, in education as a private tutor. During the feudal era, as we discussed in the earliest episodes of this miniseries, women's education was not unheard of, but it was pretty sporadic. During the Meiji period, there would be a gradual shift towards more acceptance of women's education, though still in a very patriarchal caste, of course, with the aim of preparing women to serve the role government ideologues had proclaimed should be their sole goal in life, to become ryosai kenbo, good wives and wise mothers. Still, this drive to educate women to take on this role would see the establishment of some of the first women's schools in Japan by the 1890s, and even as early as the 1870s, you do see more and more elite families investing in education for the girls in their households, usually in the form of private tutors. Several prominent families in Wakayama, usually the same prominent families which had existed before 1868 since the relatively peaceful transition to the new regime meant most of them had come out of the whole thing in good shape, hired Koume to tutor their daughters. Reading and writing were her most common subjects. Women's literacy was one of the new expectations of the Ryosai Kenbo model, so that women could help educate their own children in turn and contribute to the management of the household more effectively. Koume also taught painting, not the most practical skill, but certainly the sort of thing that could turn a few heads and make your daughter a more eligible marriage prospect. The income from all this was pretty good. One prominent Wakayama family paid Koume 2 yen a month to tutor their daughters part-time. Remember, Yusuke's full-time teacher salary was 4 yen a month. Of course, the pay wasn't always consistent. Koume records in the diary that at one point said family, when payday came around, gave her a bunch of gifts instead of cash with no explanation, and given the fact that she was essentially part-time help for them, she did not feel empowered to question it. She also helped Yusuke with his private tutoring. There's one very cute entry in the diary from the late spring of 1880 where she records, quote, "Many children came to school. Fusanosuke had a fight with the boy from the bathhouse, so I painted for them to calm them down. Then the boys all came upstairs and drew lots for the paintings. There were 16 of them." I just find the image of this grandmother doing a bunch of paintings for young boys to calm them down extremely cute, if I'm honest. Speaking of painting, that's where most of Koume's efforts went during her retirement years. She'd painted, of course, her whole life and was particularly well reputed for her mastery of the so-called bunjinga form. This roughly translates as scholars' paintings, modeled on the monochrome ink landscape paintings done by the scholarly elite, of course, of Imperial China. That in its own right is kind of interesting to think about because those scholars' paintings, which are called wenrenhua in Chinese, were a very masculine style in China, but Koume specialized in them. However, she was also not, so to speak, a one-trick pony. For example, remember way back in the second episode of the series when I talked about her hand-copying that manuscript Kankai Ibun about life in Imperial Russia? Koume made an illustrated version, with little sketches of what's described, and the style is much more caricature-y than her more formal paintings. I'm sure there's a better art term for that, I'm the wrong person to ask. She was very versatile, doing everything from folding screens for friends to painting armor and overcoats for the samurai of the domain when they'd been preparing for war in the 1850s and 1860s. One gets the impression, more than anything, of a working artist willing to take any commission that went her way, which maybe also explains why she painted so much in retirement. It wasn't just a hobby, but a way to make extra money for the family. And it was one that Koume took very seriously. In the final 6 years of the diary, she references working on some form of painting or project or another about 600 times in total. I'll include some examples of her work in the show notes. Art, in my experience, is a hard subject to cover in an audio medium unless it's the only thing you're talking about in the episode. And with Koume, there's so much to talk about already. I do want to emphasize here that Koume was a remarkable artist. The fact that I haven't spent much time on that part of her career is not a reflection of her talent, but just the constraints of the format and the fact that there are other things I want to cover. So, from 1877 on, Kawai Koume's diary focuses mostly on 3 things: painting, helping arrange marriages for her granddaughters, and Koume's failing health. Koume took her first bad fall in late 1876, injuring her hip while she was working around the house and leaving her bedridden for several days. She would take a few more falls over the subsequent years, along with increasingly bad bouts of illnesses, to the point where she was eventually unable to visit the second floor of the family compound because the stairs were too much of a challenge to navigate. One of the final sections of the diary describes the family receiving an announcement from Tokugawa Mochitsugu. Their former feudal lord had prepared a gift for Koume on the occasion of her 80th birthday by the old reckoning in February 1883. However, Koume was too ill to go receive it, and a combination of bad snow and the Lunar New Year meant no porters were available to carry her in a sedan chair. Yusuke had to go get it in her place. After 1883, the diary falls silent. Koume presumably could not keep it up anymore. She would pass away late in 1889, just 1 month short of what would have been her 85th birthday by our modern way of counting. The life of Kawai Koume is fascinating in a few different ways. The window it gives us into the fortune of the post-Restoration samurai class, or life in a provincial city, or even just the small little customs and manners of life in late feudal Japan. But as I mentioned in the first episode, one of my favorite parts of her story is looking back at what she was hearing about the big events of the day. Reading about her trying to track what was going on around the country really did bring me back to my own experience trying to track the happenings of the pandemic, or, to use a slightly darker example from my childhood, sitting in my middle school with my classmates in a suburb of New York City on September 11th, 2001, trying to figure out why all the adults were so freaked out all of a sudden. All of these experiences, from the big picture trying to understand her world to the little picture of just trying to get by day to day, are of course deeply human, and that's really what makes Koume's life so interesting, and what makes Koume's world as a book really fascinating. As you read, you really do start to feel like you get to know a person who died 99 years before I was born. And that, as I've said so many times before on this show, is an incredibly powerful feeling. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. In addition, we are coming up on episode 600. As always, we're going to do a Q&A episode, though it might be episode 601, not 600. This time, I'm only opening up the questions and answers to people who are supporters on Patreon, just to keep the number of questions a little more manageable. So if you're a Patreon supporter, thank you again for all you do to make this show possible to run. And if you're not, no time like the present. Speaking of which, special thanks to new patron George for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for an episode on one of the more unusual moments of the final years of the Tokugawa period, the Eijanaika movement.